Hey, greetings, everybody. Welcome back to my show, Patriot to the Core podcast. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope I can provide you with something that's uplifting, especially during this crazy quarantine time. Hopefully, we're going to start trying to get back out in public and getting somewhat back to normal. I think that will take quite a while, though. But today is episode number 73, and my guest is Linda Ambard. And Linda was, unfortunately, not the first person to find out about her husband's death in Afghanistan. She was notified, but it was after her coworkers knew, most of her children knew. In fact, at least one of her children found out via social media. Linda shares today why her late husband immigrated to the United States, learned English along with 7 other languages, and then chose to join the Air Force. Her notification and details of his death were far from effective, but we know who his killer was. It was an insider, someone he and his teammates trusted. And since she's been on a mission to help the Air Force know where to improve and to help military spouses understand how to avoid some of the challenges she faced in the days following his death, such as her checking account getting frozen. Linda still doesn't have clear answers, but she's forgiven Phil's killer, who killed a total of 9 Americans that day. One of them was a contractor, and 8 of them were active duty. And she still has hope for the Afghan people. We definitely talk about this. Since his death, she has run 55 marathons, and she's run almost 200. She's at 199 now, I believe. And she's ran them on 6 continents. And her 7th continent, she'll check off the box next year in 2021 when she runs in Antarctica. This has been something that's really helped her heal, is running. She's a champion of getting outside, running, and relying on your faith to get through challenges. And she's definitely a woman of action and change. And it's great having her on the show. I met her in early March at the Air Force's Survivor Advocacy Council meeting. And I was really just saddened and blown away at the things she shared with us in that meeting. You can learn more about her by visiting the links in the show notes. She's got a book, Courageously Alive. There's some excellent articles out there on what happened with the circumstances surrounding her husband's death and all the other Americans who were killed that day. So let's talk to Linda. All right, Miss Linda Ambard, thank you for being on Patriot to the Core for the first time.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk about Phil. First of all, can you tell me, why did he join the Air Force? I believe he immigrated to the U.S., so what's his story before he joined?
Well, Phil grew up in Venezuela. He was from France and Venezuela. His father is French, his mother is from Romania. And he came to the U.S. at the age of 12 speaking 2 words of English, Sumatimas for sometimes and USA for USA. And when I met him when he was 21, he spoke English as well as you and I did, and I could never figure out that he wasn't from the U.S. He spoke 10 languages fluently. But at the age of 18, he joined the military to get his American citizenship. And he started as an airman with no stripes and ended up as an officer. So he spent 26 years in the military, 16 years enlisted, 10 as an officer. And he ended up as an Air Force Academy professor.
What was he teaching there?
He was teaching French and Spanish because those were his first 2 native languages. And he had just finished his PhD in foreign languages, and he deployed 5 days after he finished his PhD.
Okay, so is this the deployment where he was killed?
It is. Okay,
all right. So let's talk about that. Why did he deploy? And then, was this a volunteer thing, or did he have to? And then,
no.
Okay.
He did not have to deploy. When he graduated with his PhD, he had been getting a PhD for 3 years, which meant that the Air Force paid him like he was active duty and he went to school. And he said, how can I mentor cadets and my own children, 4 of whom were serving, if I have never deployed? And so he chose to deploy. He chose to go over as a trainer and advisor because he believed that through education, countries and nations can change. And when he was there, the person that assassinated him actually was somebody that he had eaten lunch with and practiced languages with, who had been in the military for almost as long as Phil had been in the military and knew almost as many languages as Phil knew. This was an Afghan military member whom Phil considered a friend.
Was he there serving as a translator and an interpreter?
No, he was there as a comm officer, but he was doing a lot with with different languages. In fact, the last meeting he was there for was because the French were setting up their clinic, and Phil was there as a comm person, but also with the languages.
And what about the Afghan? What was he doing there? What was his role?
I'm really not sure what he did, but he was considered a high-ranking Afghan military member. And while I could have looked up what he did, I've never been able to get past just knowing that he was somebody that Phil considered a friend who turned out to be an assassin, and that's what I call him.
Yeah, and and I don't know how many of those situations we've had. I know that one of my brother's teammates, that happened to him about 15 days before my little brother was killed as well. So when that happened, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so real. I remember having a really hard day thinking, man, that could be my little brother. And then, of course, my brother wasn't killed that way that Phil was and that his teammate Danny was. But man, that is just, it's just, is it called, I always get it wrong. Is it called green on blue?
It is called the green on blue. And I tell you, I feel like it's the biggest travesty, because if you can't trust a person in a NATO uniform, any one of whom you would lay down your life for, then who do you trust? And in the situation where Phil and the others were killed that day, there were 9 of them, it comes down to this. 23 Afghan military members left that room alive with only a ricochet bullet wound and a broken leg by leaving the room. Not one of them stood up for any one of ours. And every one of our American people, and we were not segregated, Americans and Afghan military members, any one of our American military members would have stood for any one of them in their NATO uniforms. And I think it becomes a double whammy when you don't know who to trust in anymore.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I mean, and so as far as you know, Phil and his teammates never had any inclinations before of any reasons why they couldn't trust them.
No, and there's been a lot of supposition that way, because there were a lot of things that had changed, and it felt like there was a lot of tension going on the base. And there'd be times I'd be talking to Phil on the phone, and the internet would go down, or he'd be walking across the base. He was afraid to even drive because you'd have to go outside of the wires to go over to the part where he worked. So he always walked so he could stay within the wires to stay safe. And there would be times when you would hear things and the sirens would go off and whatnot. So I don't know how much of that was there, but I do know that they couldn't have their weapons fully engaged at that point. And that, I don't know how I believe about that, because it put one more layer of delay on our people being able to respond.
Yeah, I remember one of my brother's teammates, when he came back from one of his deployments, showing me a lot of pictures, and he was actually living with some locals, some Afghans, and he had a lot of pictures, and he was saying, look at this. You think I couldn't trust these people, but yet I was living among them. I know he was quite nervous in that situation the whole time he was there.
I always said, I kind of feel like, and this is horrible, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's always felt like they want us in their country for what we can bring, the resources that we can bring, but they don't have a value of life like we have a value of life. And it feels like they don't want us, they want what we bring. And because if they did want us, then why isn't there that layer of protection? And then I keep wondering why our American government would be apologizing like crazy if one of our people went off and killed a bunch of theirs. Mm-hmm. Where's my apology? I mean, not that words are going to make any difference, but it's just like it became a political statement of sorts. And I never wanted it to be a political statement. But I think one of the hardest things about the way Phil was killed was I lost faith in our own military, as well as NATO, as well as my sense of security. My sense of security was rocked to its very foundation.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But to back up, will you just give us the circumstances of April 27th, 2011, and what he was doing and what happened, how it all went down based on what you know anyway.
So what I know was that Phil had a meeting, and the last time I had talked to Phil was Easter Sunday, which was 3 days before he was killed. And actually 4 days before, but 3 days based on the American time. And he had called and he said, I'll call you tomorrow. He didn't call the next day, and, we couldn't always get through, so I didn't think a whole lot of it. The second day came and went, and I kind of sort of got a little bit, I started thinking about why hasn't he called, because that was unusual for him not to call. And when the third day came and went, I kind of got cranky about it. And when his day planner came back, it showed that he had meetings, that this was a really big meeting, and that he'd been in convoy one day. So he had this great big meeting that he was doing. It was a theater-style room. And so the way that looked was, it's just, there were offices on different sides. It was at the airport. There was the back room where he and 4 people were working. 4 of them were working. The contractor, the retired military person, the only female, a guy who had just got to the country, Kiba Estelle, who's on our Survivor Council, and Phil were all in that area working on the comm stuff to get the comm stuff up and going. Then you had the pilots up in the front of the room, and they were working on just getting ready for the day, weather, all the things that the pilots have to go through before they fly, coordination and whatnot. So when he came in, he was in his uniform, so he was able to get in. I will tell you, I don't know. I've heard many, many versions of what I call the fairy tale, how long it took. And that's part of the hardest part for me right now is on this side of earth and heaven, I will never know exactly what happened.
Yeah.
I will tell you, Phil was one of the last to die. His weapon is the only one missing. His trigger finger was almost shot off, and he was shot too many times to count. Nobody knows why. But understand, it wasn't Americans all in one area of that big facility. They were all intermingled. So there's a mass exodus of Afghan military members, but I know that no trained military person, not every one of those in the room would stand there and be too scared to react.
Yeah.
Now, I get that he had the element of surprise, but Phil was not in the first part of the room. His weapon is missing. His trigger finger is almost off. I don't know the whole, it doesn't even matter because it doesn't change the facts. But part of the reason why I lost confidence in the military was they couldn't give me a straight answer. And I still don't have a straight answer. From next door, 2 of our military members came over and engaged the shooter. One of them pursued him even after he had been shot, and I, to this day, think he should have a Medal of Honor because he lost his life trying to save other people in the building, and I believe that he did. Okay. And that was Nathan Nylander.
Nathan Nylander?
Nylander.
Nathan
Nylander.
Okay.
Yes. Eventually, I mean, he had enough time to write things on the wall with his blood. Who
was that? Nathan did?
The shooter.
Okay.
And he was dead. He was found dead. Nathan did shoot the shooter. I don't. But to this day, nobody can say who shot the gunman. And I think that, to me, there's some political posturing going on there to protect somebody, but I don't know. Because I think it would be really a hard thing for every Afghan military member, knowing that within the realm there are people that are traitors.
Yeah.
And if you call out the person that did something, that you put your own family at risk.
Yeah.
So I do get that on one level. It's a tough situation.
The end result was your husband Phil, and was it a total of 11 Americans killed?
No, 9.
9 Americans. And how many assassins were there? Was it 1?
They say 1. They say 1.
Okay. What do you think?
I don't know, but I know that this guy had enough time. No weapon holds as many bullets as were shot that day.
Wow.
each of those people were shot at least more than a handful, and Phil was shot too many times to count. So what is that? That's a lot of bullets.
So based on that, it just seems to me that, and this is something I'd wondered and asked you, is Phil saw that assassin's face. He knew who it was. Yeah. Linda, it sounds like there were several days went by before you were notified. How many? And then?
Not before I was notified. I was notified, several hours went by. Okay. So at 10:30 in the morning, I saw it on the MSN ticker tape when I first went to work. I got to school early because I coached children before school. And at 6 a.m., the ticker tape was 7 confirmed dead at the Kabul airport shooting. At that point, it was 7. And I thought, thank God my husband's not there. And I thought that because Phil was actually supposed to go to a place called Shindad and was diverted en route to a place called Kandahar. And my ignorance I didn't put together that Kandahar was part of the Kabul airport area. And so I wasn't even sure, I just thought he wasn't there. And selfishly, I thought, thank God my husband's not there. And it's the first and only time in my life that I went next door to somebody, told my music teacher friend, I am so thankful my husband's not there. I went about my day in blissful ignorance. At 10:30 in the morning, a general went on television and said, today we lost one of our own. And because Phil was the only Air Force Academy professor that was deployed at the time, it was a nanosecond before they figured out who he was, who I was. And they were able to, it was out everywhere. And the media was outside of my school, outside of my house, outside of the airport. When they notified me, 1:34 in the afternoon, I was teaching PE in Colorado Springs. I had 32 first graders in my classroom, my gym. The principal came to get me. And as I'm following him up the hallway, I didn't know I thought I was being let go, because that was the day they were letting all the teachers be let go. I worked for a school district that basically had declared bankruptcy. And so I had volunteered to be the one to be let go, just because I knew when Phil came home, we would PCS for 4 years before we came back to the academy. And so as I'm following the principal at the school, I'm thinking I'm losing my job. When I see the media trucks, I think, crap, I'm going to have to give an interview and be gracious and not tell everybody that I was the one that volunteered to be let go, because that's not fair to other people. And as I hit the office, all the phones are ringing, all the naughty kids are running out of the office, and everybody's staring at me, and I think, crap, I'm losing my job. And everybody knows but me. And then when we duck past the secretaries and the nurses' station, I see the sea of blue uniforms, and I realized that it wasn't good. And when I was notified, I was told that my kids were being notified at the same time. So the upshot is 2 of my kids found out on Facebook. One found out by a secondary friend telling them as I was being notified. Another found out the right way only because her phone was dead, and when she plugged it back in, she had 32 missed phone calls. And a bunch were from her brothers, a bunch were from her friends that had gone to the academy with her. And that made it really hard, because not only are you finding out the worst thing in your life, you're having to live it publicly in real time. And the Air Force, and I just want to say this, the Air Force doesn't have a lot of practice with death like this. I don't think that they did this on purpose. I think that they've learned a lot from what happened with me. But they took me home, dropped me off at my house. Nobody came in. Nobody stayed with me. I had media beating on my door. I lived in an apartment complex at this time. I had my phone ringing off the hook. And I can't even stand up. I can't even think straight. And the worst part for me is the way my kids found out. And I can't take that back. I never have that moment back. And that's, I'm a big girl, but my kids were still kids. To me, they're still kids.
Yeah. Did any of them live at home?
No.
Okay.
My youngest 2 were in college at the time. 3 were already in the military. And my youngest was 18. My oldest was 28. My youngest, who had just turned 18 just before this happened, was the youngest cadet ever to graduate from the academy. And he was the one closest to his father. And that's, I think, it was at the time and still sometimes, and one of the reasons why I'm proudest of some of the work I've done since then, it felt like the Air Force is really good at funerals and really good at burials. But after that, we're horrible. And even in a notification that went so badly, they froze my ID card by accidentally miscoding Phil's death. So I had to talk my way onto my husband's funeral, talk my way onto the base. And one of the things you don't want to have to do the day after the funeral or the day of the funeral is have to go get a new ID card. And they assigned me they called them FLO at the time, but they're FARS now, the casualty assistance person, after it's over, somebody that was in trouble for sexual misconduct. And he was never available by phone or email. And the only time that he ever wanted to be involved was when high-ranking people were coming to brief me. And that's not what we should be doing with our families.
No. Did any of those officers assigned even know Phil?
They did. All of them did.
Okay.
And I will tell you, I have forgiven all of them. And the reason why is because it takes real estate in my heart. I don't think that any of it was done intentionally. But I do think that because we didn't have the practice, a lot was done poorly or not with a lot of thought.
Linda, when we were in D.C. last month for our Survivor Advocacy Council meeting, we were sitting in that room with all the, really the top leaders of the Air Force and General Goldfein, and they had asked me to kick it off, and so I did, and it's amazing. I shared my experience, which was completely opposite of yours, and mine happened a year and a half before yours. I mean, there were definitely, I guess, some things that could have been improved, but I really had no complaints. I had a suggestion for them, and I shared that. But then when you spoke, I was almost like my jaw on the ground. I could not believe, and I know you could have taken so much more time if it was allowed, if we had it, to explain more. There was a lot that you couldn't get to, but I was blown away at what you've had to deal with. What else? You had General Goldfein in everyone else's ear. I know you talked to him afterwards. What else are some challenges that you faced? Yeah, you talked about your assets. You had no money. You couldn't get into your bank account. I think you had $40 cash. You had to borrow money. I mean, what are some other things you had to deal with?
Well, so that was probably my own stupidity. I am an old, first off, before Phil deployed, when it came time for the spouses to be briefed on, pre-deployment stuff, the Air Force Academy basically took the approach that, I'd been a military wife for 26 years. I'd been through deployments. I was a key spouse. There was really no reason for me to go through this briefing. Well, that's all well and good, but then when your husband's killed, what do you have? So the day he was killed, Phil had a second life insurance policy that he got right before he deployed. And the premium was due on it. And so I actually called USAA and told them that Phil had just been killed, and I wasn't sure what to do. And then I went to Dover the next day. I tried to use my credit card to buy water.
But Linda, first of all, how did you get to Dover? I know the Air Force typically they pay for a few family members to get there. Did they fly you commercially?
All right. So the Air Force did a really great job on this because 4 of my kids are military. And at the time, 2 people were entitled for that full flight benefit. They actually flew my daughter-in-law and my one son that wasn't military, and all 4 military members were put on orders and sent. So they did a great job that way. I have no complaints with that.
Okay.
So we get to Texas, and I try to buy water and a snack or something, and my credit card's declined. And I was like, why is it declined? But I took out another one and tried it, and they were like, ma'am, this one's bad too. My ATM card wouldn't work. The machine kept it. And what happened was by my notifying the bank. Although Colorado is a no probate state, and I had a will stating that everything came to me in the advent of Phil's death by law. That's all well and good, but you have to have a death certificate. You have to have, and as you know, when you're killed overseas, it doesn't look the same. It's a Form 1300, and that comes later. So even though my teaching salary was dumped into the account, and both of our names were on it, and it was a joint account, right before he left, we had set it up online so that we had one online username, one online password. That's well and good until the person who sets it up is killed. And then I couldn't access anything. If we had done it where we had two usernames, and even if we used the same password, my bank account would not have been frozen. So I had no assets for almost 2 weeks. I had $40 in my purse, and I wasn't real sure how it was going to work in terms of who paid what at Dover. I knew that they would reimburse me, but I wasn't sure the process of how that worked. And again, who has practice with that? Mm-hmm. And so I was thankful that my active duty children were there because they were able to, pay for the meals and things like that.
Well, Linda, how do you think things ended? I know it's not final, but how did you leave things in D.C. when we were there last month?
I have hope. I have a lot of hope. One of the reasons why I walked away from teaching school, and I love teaching PE. I was actually the popular teacher in my school. Who isn't popular when you're a PE teacher and they know you love them and you coach and whatnot. I walked away because somebody needs to be internal to the system to make a difference. And if not me, whom? And it's the way that I'm honoring and remembering and making it so other people don't go through some of the things I went through. And I really love General Goldstein. I feel like his heart is there. I felt like his heart has been there ever since I met him, and I was selected as a Gold Star voice for our Gold Star video to train about the ID cards. When he stood up, the one a couple of years ago where we went to Florida, that was the first Survivor Council. And then what we did in D.C., every single time I sit down with him, I feel like things are changing. And it's not going to change overnight, but small steps can equal a really big change.
It'll take time and nonstop, not just from the Air Force, but people like you as well. And hopefully our council is helping with that.
I want to be part of the solution.
Yeah, and you already have been. I think you've definitely taken action and haven't sit back and become a victim. And there's no way that you're a victim. Based on just even the life you live now. What's happened since? How have you dealt with Phil's death?
Well, initially, I will tell you, 5 days after he was buried, I got up and went back to work. And that gave me 9 hours a day where I felt semi-normal. And where my focus wasn't on myself, but it was on the youth I was working with. It was on something besides just how bad I felt. The other thing I did is I ran because people wanted me to talk about how I felt, and I couldn't do it. Everything was so public that the last thing I wanted to do was talk. And so I started to write, and I wrote a lot of blogs. And I shared them on Facebook because at the time I had 26 friends. And those 26 friends, 5 were my children, 1 was my mom, a couple were my aunts, a few people I worked with. And pretty soon those blogs kept getting shared, and it ended up being a book. And that book was something that I never wanted to make money off of Phil's death. And so I looked for ways to give back the proceeds of that book, and it's never going to be a lot of proceeds. And I've done that through TAPS running events, and basically I give the proceeds every few years to TAPS through the running events because they make such a difference for other people, the Tragedy Assistance Program. And
TAPS is not a specific branch of the military, right?
It is not. It's any branch, anybody that's been killed in action, line of duty, suicide, even just dying within the military realms. And it provides resources for the entire family and also for your siblings, moms and dads, and even your battle buddies. And so I did that. So TAPS became an important part of my advocacy. And I did that through running and writing and then speaking through different running events. And the second part of that was, I decided to go back to school and get a fourth master's degree in something called military resiliency counseling and something called thanatology, which is the study of basically death, how people grieve, why people die by suicide.
Did you say thanatology?
Thanatology, T-H-A-N, thanatology.
Wow, that is a new word to me.
Death ethics and things like that, because it helped me to understand ways that people grieve, what people need in that process, how people can change. It gave me a platform to understand something called positive trauma growth, which it is about resiliency, but it's also about choices. We all have choices when the worst happens. And initially you're breathing through it 1 second at a time, 1 minute at a time, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 mile, 1 marathon at a time. A marathon is 26.2 miles. I've run almost 200 of them. And there's never been one that I haven't thought that I haven't wanted to quit, or that I haven't known it's going to hurt more tomorrow and more the next day. But I also know that if I look only at the step ahead of me, I might fall, I might get lost, I might need to rest, I might need to lean on a friend, but I can get to that finish line. And grief is a lot like that. So when you get through that initial fog of grieving, where every second, every day you're thinking about it, to the point where even though it hurts, you can get there. You can do this. You can find a way. You can be proud of yourself. You can get through this. And that's that positive trauma growth mentality. And 2 years after Phil died, I was running the Boston Marathon to honor Phil. And I was at the 26-mile mark. I had one stoplight to finish the race when the first bomb went off. And the second one followed really quickly. I ran for my life. And I will tell you, I was cowering underneath a table in the Dunkin' Donuts store. I don't remember how I got there. But it was at that moment when I realized I can't let fear control me anymore. I've got to figure out a way to face my fears and to take back my life and to learn to thrive versus just survive. And a lot of my advocacy and a lot of my own personal journey of running marathons in all 7 continents has been about, and even me being here in Japan, has been about me facing my fears. And it's been about me living a full life, because I know that Phil would not want me to give up living. And sort of in a warped way, I feel like I have to live really well, because he didn't get a chance to live his life as fully as anybody could have expected him to be able to live.
How old was Phil when he was killed?
He was barely 44. He had just turned 44 April 4th.
And Linda, were you a marathon runner before his death?
I was, but not to the extent that I became after his death. When he died, I had run, I think 55 marathons, or somewhere really close to that. And I have run really close to 200. It would have been 200 this year, except for with the COVID virus. Who knows when I'll be able to run races again.
So what are your plans? It sounds like you're still waiting on one continent to get all 7 marathons.
I am.
Is that right?
The Antarctica Marathon, and I am slated to go in 2021. It's been a 5-year waiting list. And my second book is going to be about taking back my life one step at a time and facing my fears. And so I got to get it.
So what is the outlook on that book? Do you have a release date?
I haven't started it yet.
Okay.
I want to finish the 7th marathon. It's what I plan to do in retirement, which is coming faster than most people think. I'm kind of old, but not that old. And my goal is to spend my retirement the first year writing it.
Wow, that'd be great.
And that's a few years away.
Well, Linda, what about specifically with dealing with the loss of your husband, a father, and then just the difficult circumstances that you've what you've had to deal with since his death. Running has kind of helped you big time. Anything else have you been doing? What about any other physical activity or any other exercises mentally that you've started doing to help?
I would say the first thing that I did is I fell into my faith. And spiritual resiliency doesn't have to include a church faith. Mine certainly did. And it gave me hope for what lies ahead. And it grounded me because from the beginning of time, there's been evil things that people don't understand. So church faith does play into my journey forward. The second thing, with grief, you don't sleep well. And one of the things I always tell people, I'm not a pretzel, but I started doing yoga for runners. And the reason why is because it helps you to shut things off, and it helps you to relax your muscles so that you can sleep. And I do still consistently do that at least 6 days a week. I would say the third thing is when things are bad, and I've done this from the very start, I get outside. When you're outside, it gets rid of your options, and it kind of resets your batteries a little bit so that you're not surrounded by all the pictures and all the mementos. You're actually outside, you're walking, you get a chance to, maybe you do cry, and maybe you do, run really hard and get really tired, but you get a chance to come back with a new mindset when you're inside.
I agree. So those three things: faith, yoga for runners, and outside.
Yeah. Well, and running too.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I agree with all that. Of course, I've done only a little bit of yoga, but
I hate yoga, but you know what? It's good for you.
It's hard. It is hard. Let's see. What else, Linda, would you like to say about? What are you doing in Japan? I know you got your fourth master's, but what are you specifically doing over there now?
So I work for the Air Force. I'm in something called the Community Support Coordinator role, which means I work with all the helping agencies to basically meet the needs of the people. So we look at all the trends within the military. So the idea is you want to boost the positive trends and decrease the negative trends. So like DUIs, domestic assaults, any of that. And then to give people coping skills. And I do that a little bit differently than most people in the Air Force. I use something called an intentional storytelling approach. So you take those resiliency skills that are so important for coping, and you weave them into the stories, into people's stories. And everybody's story is different. And not all of them are big body slams like mine. Some of them are a series of small setbacks that put people on their knees. And I think that we're seeing that here with the virus restrictions. And you basically give them the skills within the story so that people start thinking about, how do I utilize it? If she utilized it in this strategy, this way, maybe I can utilize it. And then you partner them with a helping agency like mental health or the chaplain to deal with, what do you do if somebody's going through something really hard? How do you support them? Because it's really hard to support somebody going through a major life crisis. Or mental health, what kind of strategies could you utilize if, you constantly fall into a role that you don't want to fall into, like punching holes in the wall per se. And then by working with all the helping agencies, you get a lot of buy-in and you get a lot of people that are investing in it. I've taken that same approach to our spouses and to our youth also, because I feel like you can't just concentrate on the military member. The spouses see the behavior changes long before the military sees the behavior changes when it comes to downward spiraling. And during the COVID restriction times, I've been writing for the spouses and the school newsletters about strategies that parents and youth can use to deal with their grief over the loss of the way the school year was supposed to go, or sports, or dealing with homeschooling when you never thought you were going to have to deal with homeschooling, all of that.
One last question that I have, Linda, is you said in a Stars and Stripes interview that you agree that developing close relationships with Afghans is key to imparting change in the country. But the question begs to be asked, do they really want to change? What do you think?
Like the rest of the country, I've been watching the headlines and the broker deals with the Afghans. I don't even know if I would say I'm cautiously hopeful. I wouldn't say I was a pessimist. I'm neutral until it's proven to me that that's what they really want. It's hard for me to fathom. I think it's time for them to take more responsibility for their country. And I don't know if that's going to happen. I hope it does. But I will tell you, I would like for that to happen with the Afghan people. I think that one of the keys about Phil also deploying was he always felt like if our country was the same way the Afghan country was towards women and children, he would hope that somebody would come up and make a difference, in our country for myself and for my daughter, because he never wanted that for them.
Yeah.
So I will tell you, I have forgiven Phil's assassin. I have high hopes for Afghan people, but maybe I wouldn't even have the supposition to say what I think in terms of success.
I agree with you 100%. You don't want to be a pessimist, but man, history, long history, it's kind of hard to change based on thousands of years of acting one way.
It is.
What else, Linda? Anything else you'd like to share with us?
I will say this. Osama bin Laden was killed the day before Phil was buried. And my daughter, when asked on television if we were happy, if that represented a victory for our family, she said no. It was a moral victory for the people, but we can't rejoice in the loss of life of anybody. And I feel that way towards the military members that are lost on the Afghan side too. It's not just American families losing people. It's also Afghan soldiers being lost too. And I think in a perfect world, we'd have peace. We would have everybody committed to the same goals and ideations. But I also don't think that that's necessarily a realistic outcome. And so, as American people, I am proud of what our flag stands for. I know that Phil loved our country, and I know that he loved all the freedoms and opportunities given to him by his American citizenship. And that was a key motivator for him. And, very few people can say that they chose our country, got their citizenship, and loved the country so much that they would have given every last measure and every last day they had, and he was able to do that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on Patriot to the Core.
I loved it. Thank you for having me.
So my guest today was Miss Linda Ambard. You can find out more about her and the references from the podcast in the show notes at thadforrester.com/Linda-Ambard. If you would like to support the podcast, the greatest thing you can do is share it with a friend or someone that you know. You can also write a review in Apple Podcast or Stitcher or anywhere it will let you write reviews, but Apple Podcasts would definitely be a huge help if you would rate it and review the podcast. You can also support by going to patreon.com/Patriot to the Core, and you can be a Patreon, and that's Patreon, Patreon. Patreon is just someone who supports the cause financially. I have 3 plans to choose from, $2, $5, and $10 per month. So if you would like to do that, then head on over there, and there's a link in the show notes or on my website where you can go directly there and see what the perks are for being a Patreon. And lastly, what guests do you want to hear on the show? If you ever wonder how I select my guest, I have a lot of criteria, I guess, but the main thing would be it's people who are patriots to their country, to their fellow man. So these are people who serve and do great things. So most of them we know are military, but not all of them are. I do have a list of people, a huge list, and many of them we've already interviewed. I've got 70-something episodes now. But there's some that I used to want to talk to and I no longer care to speak with. Some of them, based on their communication with me, I'm just turned off and not interested. And some of them just will not talk with me. Maybe my podcast is too small, or I just can't get through to them. I've been trying to get with Gary Sinise for a long time, and I just cannot get through. But I'm going to. I'm working that with multiple angles, and the people that I've talked to there are saying, no, not yet. That's one I really want because I read his book, Grateful American. Awesome book. Highly recommend it. There's other people. I'm just going to share some of the ones that most people would know. I really want to talk to Drew Brees. I've been impressed with him. I wanted to talk to him a few years ago when I found out about his foundation, all the great work that he does, and they're not just in the New Orleans area, but he's done a lot for that city. I saw him on Bear Grylls a few years ago. It was great. I just read Drew Brees' book called Coming Back Stronger. I was at the doctor because I had to have Achilles surgery, feeling a little bit down because I can't do anything right now. I can't walk, and I want to get back to 100% where I can play tennis and play sports again. And there I was. I saw Drew Brees' book in there in his jersey because he used that same doctor as well. So I read his book, Coming Back Stronger, and I'm trying to get him on the show. Someone else I really want to get on the show is Glen Coffee. If someone can help me there. Glen Coffee was a running back at Alabama. Ended up getting drafted. He played for the 49ers, and he ended up joining the Army and getting deployed. He wrote a book with his dad, and I think he is a trainer or coach at the University of Alabama now, but I have not gotten any response from him yet, and I've tried for a few years. One that you may not know about is Mike Durant. If you know him from the movie Black Hawk Down, he was the pilot who was taken captive, and I actually did interview him. I met him, got his card, interviewed him a few years ago. Great podcast interview, and guess what? It didn't record, and I just felt like such a loser. And I finally contacted him when I exhausted everything, making sure there was nothing, no backup file somewhere. And I told him it didn't record. I'd love to do it again. But Mike Durant was one I wanted since almost day one of starting this podcast. And I hated that I screwed that one up back in about 2017. So if you have any other recommendations, please send them my way. I have a lot more people on the list. Many of them you will not know. They're not household names, but some of them still are. Regardless, they have great stories, and if I can get it out of them, some of these guys don't want to talk. That's their prerogative, of course. But thank you for listening. I really appreciate your support.